For my public engagement assignment, I have decided to discuss themes that have occurred throughout this course in Halifax and in other parts of Nova Scotia, and have researched other examples of these same themes occurring in other parts of the world. Right since the establishment of Halifax in 1749, many reoccurring themes have occurred in Halifax and have shown up in other parts of the world, so I wanted to create this presentation to help people recognize that these themes occur worldwide and not just in Halifax, and they're therefore global issues that need to be addressed. So multiple themes have been presented throughout this course, and the three that I found most interesting and will be explaining in this presentation are power over minorities, racism, and environmental racism. The first theme from this course that I found interesting was the theme of power over minorities. This power over minorities is when there's a minority group, which are groups of people that don't make up a large number of the population, such as the indigenous groups in Halifax, such as the Micmac. And it's when these minority groups are viewed as unimportant, usually because the majority group thinks that their needs are not as important. Usually, as a result, the more powerful group will come along and take their resources, like their land, from the minority groups. Many occurrences of people thinking they are superior over other groups and exerting their power on them was shown in this course. For example, in Halifax, there was a minority group in 1749 called the Micmac, and they were an indigenous group. They're indigenous peoples who inhabited Chebucto Bay, which is known as the Halifax Harbor today. So one day, a man named Edward Cornwallis came along with soldiers and settlers to take over Chebucto Bay, and then at this time, the Micmac then became the minority, and Cornwallis founded Halifax in 1749, essentially taking the land from the Micmac, or else he said he would kill them, so the minority really had no chance. This theme of exerting power over minorities is present in this example because there is a minority group, which is the Micmac. They were pushed off their land by the more powerful, despite inhabiting the land first. And Cornwallis did this because he essentially viewed the Micmac as inferior and worthless, which thus thinking he was more powerful than them, and so he took their land. A similar example of this theme of power over minorities is currently taking place in Australia. In Western Australia, there are 270 remote Indigenous Australian communities in rural territory. They've occupied the land for over 50,000 years, and the government today is planning on cutting services to up to 150 of these communities, so services such as access to water, their sewage systems, because the government is claiming that it's too expensive to keep them in place for these communities. This theme of power over minorities is present in this situation with the Indigenous Australians because there is a minority group, which is the Indigenous Australian communities. The communities have a right to stay on their land because they've claimed it first, but they're viewed as unimportant. And because of this, politicians are excluding the Aboriginal people from the decision-making process, so they may lose their sacred land, potentially. So the government is basically showing their power over these almost helpless communities. A second theme that occurred multiple times throughout this course is racism. Racism is the belief that members of one race are superior to members of another race, and it commonly leads to unequal treatment and discriminatory behavior, such as not having equal opportunities to get a job, to being called names, to being denied human rights. So it takes on many different forms. An example of racism occurred in Halifax in 1946. A black businesswoman named Viola Desmond was on her way to Sydney, Nova Scotia, when her car broke down in New Glasgow. So while waiting for her car to get fixed, she went to Roseland Movie Theatre to watch a movie. She went in and bought a movie ticket and attempted to sit on the main floor. However, an employee of the theater approached her and told her she could only sit on the balcony, but she refused. The employee then called the police, and Viola was jailed for 12 hours. And later, she was charged with violating prices, as she did not pay the extra tax for sitting on the main floor. Um, there are racist behaviors that are present in this situation with Viola Desmond. There were no signs in the theater saying she couldn't sit there, but employees still said she couldn't sit there. And race was actually never mentioned in the court case. She was actually charged with not paying the extra tax on her ticket, when in reality it's pretty clear that she couldn't sit in the main floor because she was black. So these racist behaviors were overlooked in court. A very similar example of racism also occurred in 1955 in the United States with an African American woman named Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was taking the bus home after work in Montgomery, Alabama, and she sat behind the 10 seats reserved for white people, so she was following the rules. Later, when the bus became crowded, the bus driver instructed her to give up her seat to a white person. However, she refused. So then the bus driver called the police, and Rosa Parks was arrested and temporarily jailed for not giving up her seat, even though it was a seat that she was allowed to be sitting in. There are many racist behaviors present in this example also. First, blacks had to sit at the back of the bus, and they had to save the seats at the front of the bus for the white people, which is unfair and shows how the African Americans were being viewed as less important. There was also unfair treatment when Rosa Parks was ordered to move, despite being in a seat reserved for white people, because even though she was following the rules, blacks were still seen as the ones to be treated unfairly, which is essentially racist behavior. And lastly, a third theme that is very important that was mentioned throughout this course is environmental racism. Environmental racism is when minority groups are forced to live in close proximity to environmentally hazardous environments, such as a factory or dump, for example. And by living in close proximity to these environments, this usually leads to negative effects on their quality of life, living conditions, and their health. This theme of environmental racism was seen in the community of Africville in the 1960s. Africville is a small black community on the outskirts of Halifax. It was a relatively poor community, being viewed as a slum by other Halifax residents. The city allowed industries, factories, a dump, and an incinerator to be built just outside of Africville. They also built train tracks running through the community, which would create a lot of direct pollution within Africville. And in addition, Africville residents did not have adequate housing, no running water systems, no sewage systems, and no garbage pickup, which again would all create poor, unhealthy conditions for people living there due to the lack of sanitation, for example. Environmental racism is present in this example with Africville because the Africville residents are the minority in Halifax, and the white population is much more abundant, and they're the majority. So the city decided to neglect Africville, so therefore the community was seen as unimportant in comparison to the rest of the white city. The city also decided to place these industries and other pollution-emitting facilities right near Africville, likely not taking into consideration the effect that it would have on the nearby residents. And all of these reasons combined resulted in the poor, unhealthy living conditions for the people of Africville, which is very unfair. And again, this theme of environmental racism has occurred in other parts of the world as well. This example starting in the 1930s and is still currently going on. In South Durban, South Africa, there are a total of 120 industries that have been built since the 1930s. South Durban contains the largest oil refinery in South Africa and has the largest concentration of petrochemical industries in South Africa as well. And some examples of facilities that South Durban contains are wastewater treatment plants, toxic waste landfill sites, an airport, paper manufacturing plants, and chemical process industries. Environmental racism is present in this example also because these 120 industries are surrounding low-income communities, mainly poor Black communities. These industries obviously create a lot of air pollution, which leads to negative health impacts for the poor communities that are forced to live nearby. And this industrial area was created by wealthy locals and the white government, who are the majority of the area. So they therefore believe that these communities living nearby are not as important, as they have shown when they decided to allow these industries to be built there. So as you can see, these three themes of power over minorities, racism, and environmental racism have been present in Halifax and Nova Scotia, as well as all over the world, and have also occurred in many different time periods. Power over minorities was seen in Halifax with the Mi'kmaq peoples and in Australia with other Indigenous communities. Racism has been seen in Nova Scotia with Viola Desmond and similarly with Rosa Parks in Alabama in the past. And lastly, environmental racism was shown in Africville and Halifax in the 1960s and currently is seen across the world in South Africa as well. Overall, I think it is important to realize that many more examples of these themes have happened in other time periods as well, and also in many other areas of the world. And it's very important to realize that these themes take on many different forms as well. For example, racism can occur through stereotyping. It's not just limited to giving other races unfair treatment in society, like in the examples that I provided. Overall, looking at the bigger picture of all these three themes from this course, and from the examples that I provided, I noticed that all three of these themes, there is a person or a group of people who are viewed as inferior to someone else or to another group of people. And as a result, these people that are being viewed as inferior are treated unfairly to the rest of society. From these examples that I have explained from class and from my research, it is clear that these themes of viewing certain people as inferior and taking actions against them has occurred in the past, is currently happening in the present, and in my opinion will continue to happen in the future. So in conclusion, I think in order to prevent these negative themes from continuing on in the future, individual people, and also governments as well, need to realize that the world can function in a more effective way if there is cooperation and equality in mind. This way, I believe it'll be more easier to solve issues that groups of people have, and solving global issues as well, if there's more cooperation and views of equality, instead of viewing people as inferior.